Hello, I'm Ben and you're watching The PhD Parent. So the current video was originally motivated by two others. One in which I looked at research investigating perceptions of low milk supply, that's where mum thinks she's not producing enough breast milk, and the other looking at actual low milk supply, that's where mum is not producing enough breast milk. Now the research in these areas suggests that one way to determine whether milk supply is low is to consider the number of poos and pees a baby is producing per day. The idea is that if these numbers are in the normal range, then that suggests that milk supply may be okay. So the point of the current video was to look at research that provides data on patterns of peeing in infants in the first few weeks and months of life, and then to do the same for pooing in a companion video, and you can check out the link to that one down below. Now if you want, you can just ignore this video and look at the figures put out by the American Academy of Pediatrics, who suggest that newborns should have 3 to 5 wet diapers per day when they're 3 to 5 days old, and 4 to 6 per day when they're 5 to 7 days old. But more interesting to dig into the research, particularly as this goes beyond the relatively short time frame covered by the above recommendations. I was also hoping to review research that's investigated the number of pees per day that would serve as a marker of insufficient milk supply, but as far as I can see, no such research has been conducted. So in the end, this video provides a general snapshot of peeing across the first 36 months of life. And to be absolutely clear, the research reviewed is descriptive, providing insight into the typical patterns of peeing that kids show up to the age of 3 years. It does not provide markers of clinical problems. So to begin with, how do you assess peeing in infants and toddlers? So a common approach that researchers use is the 4-hour voiding observation. In this approach, a pre-weighed diaper is put on the child, and an indicator strip, which tells you whether the diaper is wet, is often used and checked every 5 to 10 minutes. The volume of pee is determined by weighing the diaper, and any residual pee is measured using ultrasonography. So at the end of 4 hours, you have the record of the number of pees, the volume of pee, and the residual pee left in the bladder. Now just a quick random fact. Do you reckon infants pee in their sleep? Turns out some do, but most don't. Specifically, Jung found that most term infants either woke up or showed signs of physical arousal before peeing. And in a later study, Janssen found that about 75% of kids who were 3 months old woke up or showed signs of arousal before they peed. By 6 months of age, this figure was about 90%. So there you go, yeah, another reason why your kid won't sleep through the night. So now on to the frequency of peeing. So to check that the following represents a good coverage of the literature, I looked at reviews by Sillen and Krusen. There are a couple of papers in these reviews that I was unable to get a hold of, but I was otherwise able to include most of the relevant studies. And here is what those studies found. And I'll first look at peeing in the first month of life. So GLAD recruited about 50 infants who were between 3 to 14 days old and assessed peeing frequency using the 4-hour voiding observation approach between 9 AM to 1 PM. The researchers found that kids peed, on average, about 4.5 times across the 4-hour assessment period, with a range of 1 to 7. So around 1 pee per hour. In addition, they reported the interval between pees, which was about 50 minutes, with the longest interval being about 90 minutes on average. And also they looked at the amount of pee per void, which was about 25 mils on average. In a similar study, Chen assessed about 20 infants born at full term with a 12-hour voiding observation, starting at 9 AM and finishing at 9 PM. And this took place when kids were 1, 4, 7, 14 and 28 days old. And here is what they found with the figures rounded to the nearest 0.5. So compared to GLAD, the average pees per hour in this study was a little lower, that is 1.1 versus 0.7. Now the difference may reflect the fact that the assessment period in Chen was longer and consequently taken across different periods of the day. That is, if the number of pees per hour systematically varies as a function of the time of day, then that's at least one reason why you'll end up with differing results. So now on to peeing in the first year of life and beyond. So Holmdel recruited about 45 healthy infants who were between 2 to 12 months old and assessed peeing frequency, again using the 4-hour voiding observation approach, beginning anywhere between 8 to 10:30 AM in the morning. So across the assessment period, kids who were 2 to 6 months old peed about 4 times, once an hour, on average. Kids who were 7 to 12 months old peed about 3 times, just under once an hour, on average, and the average volume of pee was close to 35 mils. Now this is a bit higher than GLAD, but the sample in GLAD comprised younger kids, so smaller bladders. And last but not least, Duong compared kids who were living in either Vietnam or Sweden over a 3-year period beginning when they were 3 months old up to the age of 3 years. Data for the latter kids was taken from a study by Janssen in 2000. So the 4-hour voiding observation approach was once again employed, and in this study the observation started anywhere between 9 to 10 AM. Now I had to estimate the figures from a graph, so here's approximately what the researchers found. As you can see, the figures for the Vietnamese kids in the first few months were a bit lower than the Swedish kids. The researchers said that they weren't sure why, but suggested it might be because people in Vietnam tend not to drink much, and or because potty training begins much earlier in Vietnam. The results obtained for the Vietnamese children are very similar to an earlier study by Duong. So to sum up, apart from the very early days of life, that is up to 4 days old, it looks like kids pee somewhere around 0.7 to once per hour, until they hit about 3 years of age, when it drops off to around 0.5 to 0.75 times an hour. Though strictly speaking, because the assessment periods in the reported studies have almost always been a 4-hour period in the morning, these figures are only applicable to that morning period. And it wouldn't seem appropriate to extrapolate across a longer period, for example a whole day. The data reported by Glad and Chen supports this idea. That is, the Glad study was carried out over 4 hours, whereas the Chen study was carried out over 12 hours, so 3 times longer. However, the average number of times that kids peed across the 12-hour period was not 3 times more than the average number of times kids peed across the 4-hour period. It's only about 2 times more. So, while I'm no expert in infant peeing, seems that the 4-hour voiding assessment is probably not sufficient to tell you what happens across the course of a day. At any rate, while the average sits around 1 pee per hour, it's not the case that kids actually pee once an hour. That is, if you take the results of Glad, sometimes there was up to 90 minutes between pees, but then shorter durations at other times. And as you would expect, there's considerable variation across kids. In every study, all kids peed at least once during the 4-hour observation period, but the upper limit was as high as 8. So for the moment, that's it for kids peeing patterns. If there's anything I've gotten wrong, any important research I've overlooked, or if you have any questions, then feel free to get in touch. Otherwise, happy parenting.